have a confession to make. Oral presentations. Now, most of you, when you see those words oral presentations on your assignment, you're freaking out and you're thinking, oh my goodness, do I really have to present something? Can't I just write it down? But in reality, and I, for a long time, ever since I was a kid, loved giving oral presentations. There is something about standing up in front of a group of people and getting them to understand something or hear a story and then seeing their response and seeing their feedback. I absolutely love it. So I want to tell you a couple of things. Some of them I've gleaned from experience. Some of them I've kind of searched through online, and I encourage you to do the same thing. Have a look online and see what you can find about oral presentations, how to do them really well, because there are ways to do them really well. We're going to talk through this stuff. Now, the reality of oral presentations is you've got three core elements. These are the things that are going to dictate exactly how you go about creating your presentation. One of those things is the audience. Who is your audience? You know, are they a bunch of academics, grumpy academics sitting in a room and you've got to impress them with numbers and figures and show them your understanding? Or are they 10-year-old kids? You know, what do they know? What don't they know? Why are they there? You know, these are the things that have a big influence on the way that you present the information. The other important thing is the subject matter. So the kind of subject matter that you're presenting is going to have a big impact. Now, the reason these things are important is because it's going to affect the way that you do the presentation. So when you're thinking about a presentation, there are lots of ways to do oral presentations. We're going to flick through a couple of them in a minute, but the subject matter and the audience are really, really key to working out which presentation style to use. The other thing to take into account, though I wouldn't let it kind of really govern exactly what you do, is take into account your level of confidence. So if you're someone who can talk the back end off a horse and rabbit on forever, yep, you're going to need to trim that down, but giving a straight oral presentation without cues might be fine. You know, if you're telling a story or something like that, that's not a problem. But if you're really nervous, then you're going to want some cues because your brain is going to be thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to die. And in reality, what you want it to be thinking about is the next point that you're going to make. So remember these three things. You've got to think about your subject, your audience. Who are they? Why are they there? What do they need to know? What are they interested in? What's the subject matter? What is the thing that you want to get across? Because that's going to have an influence, and your level of confidence. But don't ever let your level of confidence get in the way, because the way to improve your level of confidence is just to do it again and again and keep getting more feedback. Okay? So 3 elements. Now, one of the ways, we're looking at a couple of different ways of presenting oral presentations. One might be a poster. In fact, in academic circles, it's really common to go to a conference and stand beside a poster, just like I am here, and talk about, okay, we've done this great research on the human endocrine system, and you're going to talk through that. It's still an oral presentation, but you have these kind of cues and diagrams that you can kind of talk through. So a poster might be one way that works well. This PowerPoint. Don't we love PowerPoint? I'm going to create another video on how to create amazing PowerPoints that won't bore you to tears. But PowerPoint is a really common technology. Most places where you've got to present will have this set up. You know, it's something that we use all the time, but creating a PowerPoint presentation can be a really good way of getting ideas across. Now, there's all sorts of different templates. There's all different starter versions. There's online tutorials. YouTube, is there anything you can't learn on YouTube? There's all sorts of things. So don't let the technical skills of PowerPoint get in your way, because the reality is that PowerPoint can be a really good tool. Unfortunately, the opposite is also true. It can be awful. You can abuse PowerPoint and end up with something awful. Prezi is kind of today's version of PowerPoint in many ways. Okay, to have a look at it up, have a look at Prezi and see what it will do. It will give you a visual presentation that's not quite so staid and what can be boring or stable as is PowerPoint. So Prezi can be a really good tool. Another way of doing presentations is to use movies, graphics, animations, all of those kinds of things. We can use these to present ideas. So giving a presentation, you might actually draw on movies. You might actually go, look, you know, let's show you a clip and get people to think about that. Another option is experiments. Showing, you know, doing an experiment in front of people. You think of, say, a classroom environment or an environment where you want people to learn about something. To show them an experiment where you get this natural result in these experimental conditions can be a really great way to present ideas. This other one, role play. So I know some of you freak out at the idea of role play, but role play can get people to really think about what the components are. And if you look in this situation, we've got people doing a role play where one is the injured person and they actually have to role play this process. It's not just about the technical abilities that they're learning, but about that human interaction side of things. So it can get these really complex ideas across. And the final one, though, no doubt there are more, is hands-on activities. So maybe if you're doing a presentation and you want people to think in new ways or to start to explore new ideas, you could actually get them to do an activity. So rather than them sitting there glazing over while you're telling them what you want them to know, you could get them to do an activity which leads them to that place. So these are all different ways of doing presentations, but don't be limited by these. There's a whole bunch of different ways of doing it. Now, presenting well. Some really important ideas. It's all well and good to get up and say, oh, I've got a story, I'm going to tell you a story, and then to ramble on, but the reality is that most of that will disappear if you don't have a structure. You need a clear structure, and I'm going to step you through a really simple structure that you can use, but some rules of a structure is that each section, each element of your structure should have a clear purpose. What is it that this is saying? What's the clear purpose? Define what that purpose is before you actually create the content. Make sure there's flow, that one idea needs to move into the next, that there's this clear flow of ideas, that it's logical, and not just logical to you, but take a critical eye, step away from your presentation for a while and go, you know what, does this make sense to a person who hasn't seen this stuff before? You know, what's actually going on here? And an important one, though often difficult, one idea per slide. Amusingly enough, I've just noticed that I've got 3 ideas on this slide, and so I've disobeyed the rule. Now, at uni, you will always see more than one idea per slide. So these are guidelines. If you're doing a presentation, you want it to be amazing. Personally, yep, I'd push for one idea per slide. Already, you're bored of this fantastic image. So really, I could have split that up. Understandable. Now, at uni, one of the things you'll know, one of the things that will be overwhelming is the fact that you have to use a whole bunch of terms and learn a whole bunch of new terms. So when you're giving a presentation, all the technical terms that you use, just because you know them, doesn't mean that everybody else knows them. So you want to make sure that you actually define those terms as you're going along. So if you're using a really big term, just define it. You know, say, okay, we're talking about this idea of endometriosis. I'm not even sure what it means, so I can't define it. But you know, that's what this means. So then all of the audience, even if they have no background in that area, know exactly what you're talking about. And that's really important to identify the key terms that you think everybody understands, but perhaps they don't. All right, section 1, the introduction. Now, I want you to have a think about this image. So we have this image of a bear walking on a road. We've got these other 3 bears in the background. And what I've done is I've captured your attention with this bear. You're thinking, why the hell is there a bear on the introduction? And the purpose of an introduction is to capture my attention. Now, you're not just capturing my attention willy-nilly and saying, oh, you know, look at me, I'm here. But what you're doing is you're drawing the person watching into the core idea of your story, of what it is that you're trying to get across. So I'm trying to get across this idea of a journey, that giving a presentation is this idea of a journey, and I'm getting you the idea that there's a bear in this journey and there are 3 other bears, and that they're going along a road, and that's what's going on. So you're providing the background. The background in this situation is that perhaps he's got 3 bears following him. But what's the background? Why is it that we're interested in this? You know, why is it that we're exploring this idea? What are the things that you need to understand? And this is particularly related to complex theory type questions. What are the things you need to understand in order to be able to make sense of the talk I'm just about to give? Okay? And then in your introduction, you want to identify your main point. So what's the core idea of this presentation? The core idea might be that life is really hard if you grow up in certain suburbs. Okay? That might be your core idea. So you might start with a story about somebody that you know growing up in a really difficult suburb and how difficult it was for them to kind of negotiate their way through school. Okay? Now the main point, so you would talk through that, you'd go, okay, the background information is that X number of people within Australia live in really difficult areas. This has an impact on this kind of thing, the background information. And then in terms of identifying your main point is going to be something like, look, we need to do something about this. The main point is that we actually need to think about this idea. You know, we need to think about what's going on here. So your introduction really captures those, the background information, it captures my attention. I should be sitting on the edge of my seat at the end of your introduction going, oh my goodness, I can't wait to see what the body of this talk is going to be. Now the body is where you really get into the bones of things. So if we're talking about growing up in a difficult situation, what you're going to do is you're going to identify, when you're creating your talk, you're going to identify a couple of things that you want people to know. Okay, there's no point listing off 100 different things because then we're going to walk away with nothing. Whereas if you identify, say, 2 or 3 things that you want people to walk away with, then they're far more likely to remember them. And this will create the structure around your body. So with this topic, with this topic of growing up in an area, in a tough area makes it difficult, then perhaps, your first point might be, well, having less money means that you can't afford to buy books. I'm just making this stuff up, okay? So the financial burden. The other might be that all of your friends don't really care about school. And the final one might be that you're just exhausted because you've got to go and get a job. Okay, so you're going to make these 3 points, and your body is going to have these clearly identified points, and you're going to make them, and you're going to kind of touch on them again in your conclusion. Now, what you want to do, so it's all well and good, once you've got those 3 points, what are the 2 or 3 most important things that you want to talk about in your presentation? Then what you want to do is create a story. Okay, now when I'm talking about a story, I want a flow of ideas between each of those ones. So there needs to be a logical flow of ideas. Now, sometimes, if you want to be a little bit slack, you can kind of say, okay, there are 3 main reasons that growing up in a tough area makes it harder to do well at university. And then you'll talk about the first reason, the second reason, and the third reason. And that's okay. It's not bad. But what is even better is if you can create this clear story of ideas. So you might say, okay, the first thing that is really difficult is being in high school. So rather than talking about first, you would actually talk about high school, the challenge of being in high school, and then the challenge of being in university. And then the connection between those two is when you're at high school, all of these things are a challenge. And then you have to go to university, and to be honest, you thought that it would all disappear, but the reality is some of these things continue to exist. So you see how there's this really clear flow of ideas? And by clearly identifying what your main points are and creating a clear flow of ideas, you're telling a story, and stories are far more memorable than lists or a series of facts. So really think about how you can create a story with your ideas so that the person remembers the people watching remember the story as a whole rather than this, jumbled up list. Okay? So your body. Now, that should lead to your conclusion. Now remember, you've identified what your main point is at the start. So you're going to come back to that in your conclusion. But the way that you're going to do it is you're going to recap on what your main points were. So you've got each of those main points, you've made them really, really clearly, you've articulated them well, you've created story around it, and so you're going to retell that. So you're going to say, okay, the reason it's so difficult for people growing up in tough areas to do well at school is because they don't have any friends that want to go to uni. B, financially it's a real struggle, so they have to work more hours, they don't have as much time for study. C, now I can't think of anything. C, they live a long way away from uni. They live in a really rural environment. They actually have to move house in order to go to uni. And so you're recapping what was in the body, you're not bringing up anything new, but what you want to do with those points is draw them together. So what happens to these ideas when I add them together? So then you would be drawing on something like, okay, having having no friends that go to uni, having to move away from home, and having to deal with these other issues combined makes it really, really tough. So you see how we've drawn that into one idea. We haven't just restated them and said, see, I'm just telling you what I told you before. You're saying that the combination of these things actually leads to these negative outcomes. And the negative outcomes that you're talking about, the implication that one idea that it all leads to was pre-identified in your introduction. Okay, so remember, you're going to have the most important thing. You want to keep your ideas really clear and simple. You're going to push away all sorts of irrelevant information. You're going to identify what your main point is in the introduction. You're going to clearly articulate what point your main ideas are. What are those 3 most important things? And you're going to tell them beautifully. You're going to illustrate them. You might provide evidence for them. You might say that point 1 is this, and we know this is true because this happened. So you're not just going to tell me what you think, but you're actually going to talk about the idea, tell me a story about your life, talk about some evidence depending on what you're presenting. And then in the conclusion, you're not just going to restate them, though you are going to restate them. What you're actually going to do is you're going to draw them together as one solid kind of argument that ties back to that main point. And so see, you've drawn your listener right through from drawing them in with the bear, all the way through, in with that core idea, all the way through the main points that illustrate that, all the way through to the conclusion. And so you've actually created this clear line of ideas that gets through to the conclusion, and your people are left going, oh man, I've got it now. And if you ask them afterwards, what was that about? Then they're able to clearly say, oh, well, it was about how difficult it is to get through uni when you've had a bit of a tough life, and it's these 3 reasons. Okay, So keep it simple, make sure that you do it in a clear way and tell a story. I hope that's been helpful. I look forward to seeing, well, I won't see them, I suppose, but I look forward to hearing about how good your presentations were. This is a skill worth having. There's all sorts of applications for it. All right, thanks. See you next time.